Morrow of the Golden Age, Chapter 24. The city of Odessa and its surrounds were beginning to renew in the aftermath of Ptolemy XII's bloody harvest. Doreius brought to heel the unruly folk bobbing in the wake of those crimes, and meshed together a new Odessa from colonists and farmers from the tributary villages. It was not so clean and great a thing as his rebuilding of Philippopolis, but it was a passable salve to the harm which misuse of magical knowledge had done, although he constantly spoke out against his own responsibility for that misuse, fighting a strong political current that held the Bosporans to be invaders rather than saviors. It was not the politics that concerned the prince most. Instead, his daily worries concerned the reports that a new Seleucid army had been equipped at Antiochia Mygdonia, only a week's march away. Doreius's instinct was to keep his new lands free of war, and hence he gathered an army and went to encamp close to Antiochia Mygdonia, a bold statement that would demand the enemy's attention. Furthermore, the summer of 167 prior was already underway, bringing forth the looming prospect of keeping an army in the field at harvest when his men were so desperately needed for labour. Therefore, he resolved to win safety for the current year with a quick move, relying on his own guile in the moment of action rather than a well-laid strategy. Within days of setting down stakes to mark out an army camp, the Bosporans were engaged by the rumoured army. It was found to be large, well provisioned and richly armed. 4,000 bronze-rimmed shields shimmered below a cloud of pikes, and it seemed the Seleukids had brought in Persians and Parthians to furnish a screen of light infantry. Their scouting had been able also. They wheeled along small siege weapons, including catapults, that would stymie any attempts by the Bosporans to remain in their camp and deny battle. Furthermore, since Doreius had placed his camp on open ground to heighten its visibility and thus potency as bait, it was suited to neither siege nor active fighting. Doreius took his men away from the camp as soon as he was sure the enemy was seeking it. In his own account, he says that he intended to fight in the open field so that a way past the Seleucid phalanx could be charted. In reality, he would not have to do anything so difficult as this, because the gods, for whatever reason, preferred a different course. I shall give you the best explanation I have been able to formulate for the strange engagement that took place here. Doreius claims that his intended goal was to move south and ensure the battle took place where the geography would tempt the enemy to move back towards their starting point in order to take advantage of higher ground, and in doing so delay their assault. To obscure this move, he first marched the army west. When he looked back to see if his camp had been set alight, he did not see any smoke. The scouts reported that a body of the enemy had gone through to the south, cutting off the prince's intended route. Had his plan been guessed by the enemy? Not at all. The same scout reported that other groups were moving west and east. The army had dispersed in various directions, as if they simply had no idea where Doreius had gone, and did not care to secure their formation in their search for him. This behaviour was caused by the gods. The specific gods to blame are not known. However, I will side with the common argument that it was Ares, because he had interest in coming to observe a battle between two armies who were both under his patronage. Patrons they may be, not that they were equal in this status. Ares hated and still hates the likes of Doreius. How could the gods not hate those who were so close to unravelling the weakness of the cosmos and the primacy of mankind? Ares decided to inform the Seleukids of what Doreius had planned, telling them his present location. He appeared in the form of a house cat, preening itself in the deserted camp. The Seleukids were pious enough to know this unusual sight was provided by divine intervention. The seers came up and noted that the cat refused to look at them, instead staring to the west. Men were sent to see what might be worthy of its attention, encountering tracks in the sand that had not been properly swept away as Doreius marched. When the soldiers tried to offer the cat some milk they had collected from a wild auroch, it ran away with a snarl and soon had disappeared. Once everyone had been informed that the gods were almost certainly suggesting a westward path, discord and debate spread like a plague through the men. Some of them had heard what the Oracle of Regi had been saying. That is a name for the one we know to be Aeneas, who was known through rumour as a source of otherworldly wisdom, and I shall not insist that he was not. This included the notion that the gods were not to be trusted, and that powerful and dangerous idea had some support among the soldiery. Therefore, a large number of troops concluded that the best course would be any but a westward one, with more pious men thinking the opposite. There was sufficient disagreement that men began to act out of order, and groups went to prove their point by scouting in one direction or another. Soon, most of the army was dispersed everywhere, and Doreius was stunned with gratitude. He vowed that if he could fight his way back to his camp, he would retrieve his cattle tied up there and give open sacrifice to the earth, inviting any gods who understood the goodness of this to partake. Whether Ares would be willing to accept that invitation I cannot say, but if one reads between the lines, it can be seen that Ares was still present on the field as Doreius advanced, because the perfection of the fighting that took place was not attributable to human fortune alone. The Bosporans threw away any luggage they had with them, including protectives, and ran to get back to the camp quickly. The Seleukids who were in their path huddled together into small formations, but they were hopelessly outmatched. The Bosporans released arrows and slingstones without ever getting close enough to be troubled by Seleukid pikes. These inflicted horrid wounds because the Seleukids could not turn their shields to check all directions at once. The missiles were like the calls of a drover, driving these soldiers back and together from all directions, so that they died upon each other and created a mound of pierced bodies. Doreius brought up priests to kill the wounded and place stakes around these mounds, so that spells of rejuvenation could be done, properly returning the warrior's strength to the world. He had a few lithosis of pure breed with him that might have helped with this, but they had departed on their horses to scout for the enemy. On these ventures, they found and destroyed the catapults set up to threaten the camp, aiding in Doreius' return and scattering the enemy's civilian followers loitering in ignorance nearby. By the time the cattle in the Bosporan camp were being prepared for their righteous purpose, the Seleukids had suffered several thousand killed, and as many more detached from their officers to wander the desert. The land here was not especially harsh, so it is likely most returned to Antiochia Mygdonia shortly. Doreius did not follow them because he had other uses for his men, as I have already said. He left the frontier in victory, knowing he had brought his people further days of peace. The number of days in question were surprisingly few, because the Seleukids still had many troops yet to complete muster, creating the effect that the defeated army was larger when it got home than when it had been set off, despite their humiliating defeat. And the questions they were left with regarding the role of the gods in their military fortunes must have been so hard to consider that many of them must have inflicted wounds upon their own minds in trying to answer them. While I am not entirely serious, there are stories of such things one hears from time to time. Doreius' reputation was swelled by this timely victory and considerate release of his troops. I have said already that there were those in the surrounding regions who were desperate for any improvement to their lives after centuries of near slavery, so these people were clamoring for a place in Doreius' new cities. A notable group were Armenian and Arabian refugees who had been living in a colony the Armenians had recently built on the Arabian frontier. They said that men had come from the desert and destroyed their town without mercy, and it was obvious from the description of the event that Prince Dion was the perpetrator. Indeed, the prince apparently treated the frontier peoples of Arabia very harshly, wishing that none would dare disturb his tenuous and hardly defended territories there. One cannot argue that it was not an effective approach, as ever is the case with Dion, although one feels inclined to argue against it all the same. This is the duty of others, so let us move on. By the summer of 167 prior, Pyracedes had at last overcome his doubts about the Himanian people, so he went out with his soldiers and second son Aristippus to extend his conquests further. Special considerations needed to be made in heading so deep into the uncivilized places of the world. There were no maps of any use, for the Himanians were not interested in knowing their lands too well. This is because they were accustomed to moving around frequently, and they considered becoming attached to one place or another to be a weakness. This stands in contrast to the nomads, who have a similar custom, yet enjoy knowing the locations of important places. It could be the nature of the European forest that explains this difference, for it is so vast and all-encompassing that it could be said that there are very few remarkable places to chart, akin to mapping the surface of the ocean. But like with the ocean, there are always those who will make it their business to know how to traverse it, and people like these came forward from villages wherever Parysades went, eager for payment and the chance to serve as mercenaries. Thus, Parysades and company could travel from place to place like a sailor visiting the islands of the Aegean, although this land was vaster than that sea, and the pace of movement was slower than by ship. By autumn, Parysades had taken oaths from uncountable numbers of villagers, who were probably hoping that they would never see the indomitable foreigner again. There was only one small battle at a town called Erigelia, which was held by rich tribesmen on account of its good access to the rivers and trails that led to other tribal territories. Since it was a fine strategic point, Parysades had Aristippus establish a garrison there and begin teaching the local people about the truth of the world. The king wished to carry on sailing the Green Seas, as it were, and was able to use his knowledge of the stars to have his scholars determine their actual location. He realized he had strayed very far from Kysurgis, and there were certainly places closer by to his home base that he needed to take submission from. For that reason, he began hiring guides to take him east, towards the part of the forest called Swabia, after the Swaby chiefdom that had conquered many of the people there. They stood apart from the general label of Cimbri given to the northerner-led alliance of other tribes who wished to conquer south. It would have taken only a few weeks to wipe this small chiefdom from the border, had there not been a savage intervention on the part of the gods, perhaps seeing that a stronger hand than that of Ares was needed to waylay the destiny of Manos's creations. Before departing Erigelia, the king dispatched witness Theotrophies to properly mark the trail back to friendly territory, and to summon engineers from Apollon for the proper attachment of the people to civilization. It was not a certain thing that the party would complete this journey successfully, given the treacherous nature of the people to be found nearby, let alone the geographic difficulties. This concerned the king greatly, and only with substantial effort did his officers convince him not to take the entire army to escort his good friend. Instead, he conceded to the military expediency of going east to secure a shorter route of communication, and to take more ignorant people into his domain quickly, so that they might be put to use in building the Golden Age. The various journeys began with the coming of spring, very late in those dark places. After several days, the king was almost killed when a tree suddenly fell across a trail in front of him. It was judged to have been affected by disease. However, Parysades was in a state of absolute alertness for any news that omens carried. Omens were hard to find in the forest, as birds were overly numerous, and other beasts that the gods used as messengers were quick to escape in the rare cases that they were even spotted. The Lithosis troops considered such divination to be silly, I believe, as they were long secure in the knowledge that the paragon deities were all that mattered, and their existence was found only in the inner life of humans. Having been outside of the interest of the cosmic gods, the Lithosis were lucky in the simplicity of their religious lives. But Parysades was forced to fear the cosmic gods, and so he feared that fallen tree like it was an army of 10,000 Himanian spear husbands. The men at first resorted to cutting down trees beside the trail and pushing them away, so that the king might be less afraid, but this was a hopeless task with so many tall trees all around. Ultimately, the expedition turned back, and resumed approximately 10 days later after various sacrifices had been made and local gods had been introduced to the king. The army left only slightly too late to receive important news from the south, which Aristippus abandoned his post to deliver to the king along the eastward trail. It was this news, or its origin, that caused the king to be so struck with weakness before that fallen tree, and indeed to become forever after weakened. It concerned his lifelong companion, and by rarely cited lore his eldest son, witness Theotrophies. He had been in the company of this man from his early boyhood, first as guardian, then chaperone, then spy, then co-adventurer, companion rider, strategist, and all throughout as a friend. That is why he was so alert to the messages of the fates. Theotrophies, at the moment that tree in the Himanian forest fell, had died. Here is what happened. Theotrophies, being rather clever, had navigated his way back to Pannonia through a novel route that he had instinctually sensed through his dealings with local people, and from there had quickly achieved Apollon to arrange support for the frontier. This he did not successfully complete because of what occurred after he first reported all the news to the court. As he was descending the steps from the citadel, Theotrophes turned to his adjutants and said, "I have just been told that I am going to die before I reach the final step. The voice came from far away, beyond the world." He gestured towards the stars in the sky, and cited Zeus and his many offspring as the bearers of this dire message. A priest was called from the citadel. The best he could come up with was for Theotrophes to ascend the stairs and remain inside. However, Theotrophes was not willing or able to comply. Instead, he paced back and forth on the same stair he had halted on, and behaved as if he could not hear the protestations around him. Seeming to hit upon some private idea, he turned to the sky and proclaimed, "Even I cannot return to the earth? Oh well then, if that is the case, eat heartily, you uneasy beasts, because your portions will become meagre when my king tells all humanity what the world truly is." At this, he quickly charged down the steps and crumpled over as soon as his foot touched the road. There was no doubt that he was dead, and no doubt that the gods had been waiting for this moment. Why? Because they knew what a dreadful wound it would inflict upon the man causing them so much trouble, Parysades. So we return to Aristippus, who had taken upon himself the duty of delivering the news to his father. It is from him we learn of Parysades' awful reaction, and it is notable that the official record of the campaign had nothing at all to say of the matter. In fact, the official record makes for a very dubious account. I shall explain this. First, know that the ultimate result of the eastward march was the discovery and rapid subjugation of a large town named Lupfadon. The original name is said to be unknown, but Aristippus talks about a place called Wadis that I think is the same place. This location was a stronghold of the Swaby tribe, who we shall now come to know very soon, and were known to the Bosporans as cautious neighbours who had not committed to the Cimbri cause nor the Bosporan one. Aristippus had taken command over the army and surprised Lupfadon by arriving from a rarely travelled route. These are plentiful in Germania. The town was abandoned almost bloodlessly, and it might be called a great victory if the spoils were not so meagre, being likely outweighed by the task of holding this exotic location with little wealth to contribute. The point I wish to land upon is that the record says this town was seized in the 7th month of 166, whereas the army departed Irregulis in the 3rd month. Previous analyses have simply marvelled at how great the distances between the pockets of life in the forest must be, but modern maps have made the distances involved rather certain. Irregulis, Lupfadon and the Bosporan base at Casurgis were all quite close together, being within 500 stadies of each other. Any resident of these places will tell you this if you care to listen. Even taking unfamiliar terrain into consideration, the journey Parysades undertook would be no more than 2 weeks in duration, and that is ignoring how quickly the Lithosis usually moved. That is why I believe Aristippus' own history of the matter above all others, despite all others being in disagreement with Aristippus and seeming to support each other. For Aristippus tells us why months of otherworldly isolation fell upon the Bosporan army. Of course, it was because the king had been removed from the world he once knew. Parysades attempted to rebuild his lost companion from his own blood, practicing a kind of magic that some of the cult of Gwenna apparently developed only very recently. That might explain why it did not work, and caused the king to become so ill that the army was halted deep in the forest. Caravans were called via the long route to the west and south, despite a forward route east and south actually being only half the distance to Casurgis. That was still not clearly understood. The king's magic was felt powerfully by the soldiers. Aristippus had them taking part in various ceremonies that made use of forest plants to create potions that enhanced the connection between men and the earth, so that human blood could make new things in the world. Even this was not enough to create a person, but the spirits that reside in the world came to dine and sing with the troops happily. Aristippus writes at length about all he remembers of this, and confesses that he knows there is plenty he doesn't remember. I am among the few who does not write all of this stuff off as drunken tomfoolery, and I think that as we progress to the Golden Age, incidents like this will become so commonplace that others will realize Aristippus was being as honest as ever. We have here a perfect reason for why the military records of the time contain apparent mistakes. The eventual occupation of Lupforden was the beginning of a quite unwanted and perhaps then unwarranted war with the Swaby Confederation, who possessed a network of defensive alliances between tribes which would now rouse tens of thousands of warriors to resist the Bosporans. Most of them had been preparing for just such a thing for years prior. Their preparations were obvious from the speed at which the forest seemed to come alive with enemies. There were places that only true Hernanians could go in the Black Forest, and through these hidden paths and stealthy rivers there was arriving a flow of warriors to a place far from where the Bosporans were now, choosing instead to go to a place the Bosporans thought had been humbled and set aside. Warbands flowed out to the south of the theatre, so that they were all over the roads linking Pannonia to Casurgis. These were the places that had been so recently devastated in punishment for their support of the Hernanians, and were now to be plundered again by the Hernanians themselves. Of course, they were entirely different people from their own points of view, and I think the Bosporan War was practically an excuse for certain villages to enact sinister things on others under the guise of military need. By controlling the line of communication, the Swaby were able to send defectors to deliver censored news to Apollon. This was the expected news that some distant town had been conquered handily, saying nothing else and implying no further danger. This scheme almost succeeded. The Council of Nobles, the body running legal affairs in Apollon, was overjoyed at the news and began to organize expensive celebrations. However, witness Cleonicus intervened and forced them to rescind all purchases and place the money in the public treasury as punishment. He scolded the people of Apollon for allowing their rulers to behave as if a war, which had actually only just started, had been brought to a happy conclusion. Cleonicus knew well that good news was always delivered with bad news over leaf, for that was the god's nature. Coming to understand this, the people were from then on more on guard about these matters. The unlearned nobles were very unhappy with this, and any not already plotting to remove the city from the jurisdiction of the witnesses eagerly added their weight to such bills. That they were willing to do this only demonstrates that their knowledge of good kings and ability to fall into order was lacking. But these were older men, after all, and they had not spent much time knowing the truth. Some say this in defense of many people even today, so I don't like to employ this kind of argument. Because of the increased vigilance Cleonicus encouraged, he was able to discover that his messengers had been turned by the enemy, and he used his own men to ascertain the true strategic situation. Seeing peril in that picture, he dispatched most of the troops garrisoned at Apollon to run through Pannonia and take up positions in Nitwawa, a Hernanian trading post I have mentioned in passing before. It was more significant now than then, because the Bosporans had surrounded the place with walls and consolidated several surrounding villages into a single urban centre for the purposes of overseeing the people's labours and exposing them to the words of Manos in a straightforward way. This made it an ideal place for the Hernanians to raid and for the Bosporans to make a stand. The only other useful location would have been the walls of Apollon itself, for all of the land in between was undisciplined colonial tracts worked by men who, by Cleonicus's orders, were not permitted to own weapons. This policy was a compromise to the nobility of Apollon and the two Pannonian city councils of recent birth, who all held their stock of foreign freedmen to be of doubtful character for no reason. Overall, it appears Cleonicus had invited danger with one hand and uncovered it and repelled it with the other. He was not unlike the fates he played against. Perhaps his most important edict was to have Lithosis' riders navigate past the enemy and alert the king to all that was really happening, and indeed that any news he had received recently was probably written and distributed by their devious enemy. There had been a great deal of this, but it had not affected very much, because the king had refused to read news from the south, fearing such an avenue of new developments now. Always having been lucky, the king remained so even in his anguish, and that is as much as I need say about the strength of fortune in aiding those who follow good men. The messages in question were a variety of misdirections, attempting to make the king take his army west. Instead, he went east, though it was Prince Aristippus in charge of most things by this time. Once word arrived that the messages had been falsified, the king took the army with greater confidence to approach the one place it seemed those messages had not wished them to be, that being even further east than Lapfadon. Hence they came to the capital city of all the Swaby, which was called Bedogis. This was where the Swaby were mustering a new army to hunt the Bosporans once the latter had lost themselves in the forest. Instead, those Bosporans arrived in good order before the muster was complete, and terrified the leading families of the city. The city was not walled because they had been burned down, and furthermore there was a martial spirit about these people, similar to the city of Sparta, in which wealth in defensive measures was taken as an admission of defeat, so to speak. Do not seek a rational explanation from such people who believe this. Because the king did not seem interested in commanding his men, Aristippus ordered his 5,000 soldiers to go and challenge for battle on a hillside close to the Swaby camp. It was a finely chosen site, with a forest to guard his rear and open ground in front, with a river further on that would pin the enemy if they attempted to escape. In fact, it was so strong that there is a chance that the Swaby would refuse to attack it, which was a subtlety that the prince did not appreciate, since he was learning these things bit by bit between the things that interested him more deeply, such as comic verse. We do not know what the strategy the Swaby had in mind was, and it hardly mattered in the face of what actually took place next. Once the Himanians had deployed into the open field, wielding tall shields and thick tunics of violent hue, a product of Bedogis' admirable industry, there came a stirring from the Bosporan rear line. A horse ran out towards the enemy, with a rider brandishing a Thessalian longsword. The rider was certainly a Greek companion, yet wore no cloak. The briefest investigation revealed that it was King Pyrrhosiades. He rode alone towards the enemy, with sword in hand, his gold-laurelled helmet and turquoise cloak left in the bracken underrunning the tree line. Seeing this, the Lithosis riders Aristippus had ordered to remain in the rear corners of his formation came alive and dashed after their master. 2,000 horses were launched down the hill and across the plains, directly into the front of the enemy formations. The fastest racers caught up with the king and took him away from the most intense danger, but he was adamant that battle was the only salve for his mind. He did not fight as a general, let alone as a king, but as a man whose blade could change the world by his command, and he did so again and again as a bloody reminder that existence is not hopeless, and the gods cannot cut apart the strings of fate so well as a trained man. The Swaby did not have many horses to cover the large space they were forced to contest. You will know already that the Lithosis had no trouble in surrounding and exploiting such foes in cases like these, not requiring any steering by leaders. It would take a skilled leader to persuade them to do anything differently. After having been in the forest for such a long time, the horses delighted in running around by the open riverbanks and fields close to the city, basking in the fading heat of a short summer already at an end. All round, arrows were digging into hapless men or clattering down to be crunched underfoot alongside the bodies of the dead. The Swaby might have heard rumours of other tribes the Eastern horsemen had done this to. Now they could be certain of their inferiority of warriors at the conclusion of their lives, which I have heard is something that helps prevent spirits of deceased men causing trouble after large battles. Some of the Swaby were driven towards the hillside camp, so Aristippus came out and joined the final motions of the battle. Those who lived fled to the city, wherein they would spread fear and panic of the sort that had surrender blooming on the lips of all, quietened only by fears that the Bosporans would be cruel captors given their merciless approach to battle. The city folk likely saw the Lithosis collecting the bodies of the fallen and damming the river so that all the horses could cross quickly. This also helped spread the spilt blood over the nearby lands, and it is said that the effect of this was that the trees all around reddened with signs of autumn over a single night, so that they might be the same colour now as the earth. Eager were they to begin their meditations and awake in the new world that approached. No one has ever measured the thoughts of trees, but I am certain that what I've said here must be true in this special case. The king emerged afterwards with no shortage of blood on his person. He gave Aristippus the Thessalian longsword, now in unusable condition, and made apologies to his officers for his behaviour. At this, everyone dropped to their knees and praised their king, and together invited the world to let the king before them be the one who renewed the Golden Age, a world of perfect human life. Pyrrhosides pretended that none of this happened in his account, but again his son was horridly honest about everything he saw. That is how we know also that the king's mood began to recover, although I would say he wore his duty more wearily after this day. This victory was grand and decisive, but hardly mattered if one considers that the main strength of the Swaby was still at large in Bosporan territory. Hence we should turn to what happened when those forces coalesced on Nitrawa and the meagre force of second-rate troops that now stood between the invaders and the very heart of the Western Empire. Even after what I have just described, I assure you that the bloodier battle of this war was the one that is now to come.